And these are stacked one upon the other with intervertebral discs in between. They're given numbers like T6 means your sixth thoracic vertebra. The prominent features of a vertebra, other than the hole that the spinal cord goes through, I suppose, is you have two projections sticking out the side called transverse processes, and then you have one posteriorly called the spinous process. These spinous processes are just underneath the surface and are the bumps on your back. Okay? And here we see the articulation of a rib with a thoracic vertebra. Okay, and you see that the rib actually articulates in two different places. Okay, the so-called costovertebral articulation is twofold. Costo means rib, so costovertebral articulation. And we have a lot of hyaline cartilage, okay, which allows us to expand and contract the chest cavity as we breathe, which is pretty important. And here we look at the sternum, okay, and the sternum really has three regions in it. Your breastbone, sort of a triangular section called the manubrium. And the superior aspect, the most prominent feature is the jugular notch. You can put your finger, it's just the right size to put your finger in the jugular notch of your manubrium, right there. Okay? And your sternoclavicular articulations off to the side, on either side, and the clavicle articulates there. Okay. The body, and interestingly, we have this fragile little xiphoid process protruding inferiorly, and you can palpate that too. If you ever have to do the Heimlich maneuver on somebody, make sure you get your arms underneath the xiphoid process, or you'll break it off and rupture the transverse colon. That's what they teach you when they teach you to do the Heimlich maneuver.
Or above for CPR.
Yeah, the same thing. You don't want to, that breaks off easily and you'll rupture the transverse colon and you can die of peritonitis. So, okay, and you can see why CPR works so well because the sternum is so close to the left ventricle of the heart. So. Okay, so these will be the parts of a vertebra that we will be learning. Okay, and they're just a bunch of words as we see them here. Not all vertebrae possess all these parts either. So that's what we'll be learning about tonight. This is one of the easier labs, might be the easiest one. Okay. So generic anatomy, as I said, we have the body, and then connecting the body to the whole rest of it are two little necks on either side called the pedicle. Then protruding out to the side we have the transverse processes, okay, and the spinous process, and there are numerous articular facets with which this vertebral body articulates with the next one up or the next one down. There's a whole, these vertebrae fit together just like pieces on a jigsaw puzzle. And if you think about it, that imparts stability to the vertebral column. Okay? So we have every vertebra has a pair of superior articular facets and inferior articular facets that it uses to fit into the adjacent vertebra. Okay? A thoracic vertebra also has articular facets that it uses to articulate with ribs. So a whole bunch of facets going on here. And of course, the anatomy of a disc that we've learned so well, the annulus fibrosus and the nucleus pulposus. Okay? There are three types of vertebrae. The cervical vertebrae of the neck, okay? And of course, they will be the smallest of all because they bear the least weight. There are 7 of them, and they're marked. The way you tell you've got a cervical vertebra is you've got the little holes on the side, the transverse foramina, plural. Okay? And here you have the superior articular facet with which it articulates with the next one up. The spinous processes tend to be bifid, which is the fancy word for split. The thoracic vertebrae have pretty much the same features except no transverse foramen. So you know immediately you don't have a cervical vertebra. The body has little facets on the sides of the weight-bearing part with which it articulates with the ribs. And notice the transverse process also possesses articular cartilage. The rib articulates with the vertebral body in 2 different places. Ribs articulate with thoracic vertebrae. Okay? And very often these facets will be either at the top or the bottom of a vertebral body, so we call them a half of a facet, a demi-facet. Demi is French for half. Maybe Latin for half too, I don't know. So we'll talk about costovertebral demi-facets. What's costovertebral mean? Between the rib and the vertebra. The lumbar vertebrae are great big honkers because they bear the most weight, and they don't possess costovertebral demi-facets, and they don't possess transverse foramina, and they're great big. And there are only 5 of them. There are 12 thoracic vertebrae, 7 cervical vertebrae, and 5 lumbar vertebrae. But the same generic features, the pedicle. I forgot to mention the lamina back here. The pedicle is this little neck that connects the front half with the back half. And then this little flat region that connects the transverse process with the spinous process is called the lamina. So, of the 3 types of vertebrae, how do you recognize one from another? Well, the cervical vertebrae possess those transverse foramina. Thoracic vertebrae possess those facets on the body of the vertebra, costovertebral demi-facets. Lumbar vertebrae possess neither, and they're real big. Okay. So there they are. You see the holes on the sides? It's cervical. You see the little demi-facets on the body, and they're thoracic. You see neither of those, and if it's great big, they're lumbar. And so here we show lumbar vertebrae articulating with each other by means of these facets. So kind of doesn't show up too well here. But you see the abbreviations that we use. What would be just above L1?
The head.
T12. Okay, there are 12 thoracic vertebrae. Okay. You only have 3 lumbar vertebrae?
5.
Got 5, yeah. So here we see our 7 cervical vertebrae. The top 2 are so important, they're actually given names because they're involved with the neck joint, the pivot joint that when we turn our head. C1 pivots on C2. Very important pivot joint. We have 12 thoracic vertebrae that articulate with ribs, 5 lumbar vertebrae, okay, and finally the sacrum is 5 fused vertebrae. okay? But we still have, we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves emanating out of the entire spine, and so those are certainly very important. These little holes in the sacrum are holes through which spinal nerves emanate. Okay, the spinal nerves that control your legs, for instance, pretty important stuff. Okay, so C1 and C2 are actually given names, and they're quite atypical. They do possess, because they're cervical vertebrae, they got the little holes in the side. But C1 is very flat, possesses no spinous process at all. And C2 is marked by a peg called the dens, or the odontoid process, that fits right into this position right here. And C1 pivots on this peg. Okay? And here you see that both of them fit together. This is C1, and this is C2. And we see the peg sticking up right by the anterior arch of C1. Okay? And there's a ligament that holds that peg in place, very important one, called the transverse ligament. Do you guys remember Christopher Reeves? When he fell off that horse, he broke this ligament. And what happens when you break this ligament is that your head pitches forward and the peg rams right into the spinal cord, and you're paralyzed from that point down. That's what the knot on the hangman's rope does, is it bends your head forward and breaks the transverse ligament. It's called a hangman's fracture when you break that transverse ligament. Very, 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 very serious injury. So you can see the axis of rotation of the head, and the occipital condyles of the cranium sit right there on the superior articular facets of C1. So lots of pretty important anatomy there. Okay. There's the sacrum, 5 fused vertebrae. There's a little sacral canal. We actually had a real sacrum where I was before. The walls are very thin and the whole thing was really light, very fragile. You know, you can't get one if you ordered it. The big plastic ones really don't show you what they're really like at all, as you'll see. But they're a pair of superior articular facets that articulate with the inferior articular facets of L5. Right there. And you see very important spinal nerves emanate both posteriorly and anteriorly out of here. Okay, lots of ligamentous support. Part of the function of these spinous processes is that there are all kinds of ligaments, as well as the transverse processes. There are ligaments connecting every one to every other one, adding support to the vertebral column. There, in between every pair of vertebrae, there are a pair of intervertebral foramina coming out the sides, and that's where the spinal nerves come out. The 31 pairs of spinal nerves emanate out of these intervertebral foramina, and they come out bilaterally out both sides. Okay. So, and you can see spinal nerves there. And the spinal nerves are given numbers that correspond to the closest vertebral body. Okay, the sacroiliac joint, highly reinforced structure there. Okay, view of a typical thoracic spine, and you can see the vertebral bodies, and this is the spinal canal, and these are the spinous processes. So we're slicing right mid-sagittally right through the vertebral bodies so we can see the cord. You can see the manubrium and the body of the sternum and the xiphoid process. The hyoid bone is not, it doesn't articulate with any other bone. It's held in place by a whole bunch of muscles. They mentioned the stylohyoid muscle, that's only one of them. There's the sternohyoid and the mylohyoid and the omohyoid, all kinds of muscles attached to this free-floating bone. It also serves as the upper margin of the larynx. Okay? If you watch many police movies, they're always talking about how if the hyoid bone is broken, it meant that the person was throttled, you know, that got killed. Okay? The abdominal muscles, there are 2 misspellings in your lab, and I wrote them over here on the board. So you want to write those down, because these are the correct spellings I have written on the board.
Can you say them out loud?
But
Can you
You
say them out
can't
loud?
see him back there. There's a glare.
Transverse abdominis.
oh yes, well here they are. Transversus abdominis, so that's spelled correctly. And rectus abdominis. So what you have with these abdominal muscles, one of the biggest problems with abdominal surgery, is the trauma that you incur when you slice through all these muscles. It's not a good thing to have to slice through all this musculature. And we get an awful lot of support from this musculature. Bilaterally, we have 3 layers on each side, and we just have one muscle down the center. The muscle we have down the center is the rectus abdominis, misspelled in your lab.
It cuts off when you print
Huh?
anyway. It cuts off when you print anyway, so.
Yeah. And then we have 3 layers on each side, and it helps you name them if you look at the grain of the muscle. Okay? We know that this is the transverse plane, or axial transverse, and so the grain of the innermost muscle is in that plane, so we call it transversus abdominis. Both of these layers have the grain that runs at an oblique angle, 45-degree angle. So the deep one is called internal oblique, and the superficial one is called external oblique. So you just look at the grain of the muscle, and we can actually find those on that chest plate that I have over there. So that's naming the muscles, and that's all the muscles we got. So that's a fresh breath. You can see that bilaterally we got 3 layers with just one big layer down the front. Various back disorders that you don't have to know, but I certainly wouldn't want to have. Okay, the vertebral canal is that canal through which the spinal cord proceeds. And you can see the spinal nerves coming out to the side and passing out through the intervertebral foramen. And here you see the body, the weight-bearing part, and the superior articular facet. So tell me, is this a cervical, thoracic, or lumbar vertebra? Cervical, it got the holes right there. Okay, at about L1, the spinal cord ceases as a cord and turns into a bunch of filaments. The filaments are very important. Every filament becomes a spinal nerve. This region of the cord is known as the cauda equina, which is Latin for horsetail. Okay? So you can actually see the cauda equina shown here, the end of the cord, and the cauda equina. We'll talk all about the spinal cord in next quarter. Here you see a beautiful coronal MRI that shows the peg. Okay. So this is, the peg is on C2, so this has to be C1 up here. So all sorts of good anatomy there, your various cervical vertebrae. You can actually see the apex of each one there. And here is the mid-sagittal view showing the peg. And interestingly, remember how that peg stuck up into C1? And the anterior arch of C1 was just anterior to the peg, the dens. This little dot here, we're slicing through the anterior arch of C1. Yeah, I've been known to ask that. Name that little spot. The anterior arch of C1. This is a great picture, shows the epiglottis and all sorts of stuff. Oh, we have a bulging disc here. Oh, look at that. This person could have really severe neurological symptoms if you have a bulging disc clear up this high. Okay, a kyphotic person, you've seen these people who appear to have hunchbacks and their head is bent way over forward. That's called kyphosis. It can result from bad posture, but I imagine there might be a hereditary cue for that as well. Okay, compression fracture, very nasty, and that's actually the cord. A tumor in the spinal cord, that's pretty awful. Herniated cervical disc, you can see the disc material impinging on the cord.
Are bulging and herniated the same thing?
Yeah. Well, herniated means ruptured. It's actually ruptured. Bulging would be pre-herniation, yeah. But you can have neurological symptoms from, you still get impingement.
Compression and
Yeah, right. Breast cancer metastasizes generally to two places, either the brain or the spine. This is a hemorrhage in the spinal cord. A congenital, you may have heard of spondylosis. Look at the cord. This is T1, which tends to show anatomy. A T1 weighted image. A T2 weighted image tends to show pathology a little better. So, name the muscle. Transversus abdominis. Okay, what's this one here? Rectus abdominis. Those are the two that were misspelled. Okay, what's this structure? The dens, or the odontoid process of C2, the peg that your head pivots on. Okay, so all kinds of things. I name the structure. Spinous process.
Yes.
And this is the intervertebral foramen through which spinal nerves emanate. So here we see the superior articular facets, the superior aperture, and the sacral canals down inside. Coccyx is your tailbone, which is sort of a vestigial organ that's slowly disappearing, I imagine, from when we used to have tails. And of course, we have the superior articular facet. I heard that. Spinous process. This part is called the lamina. What's that part called?
Neck.
Pedicle. Pedicle, yeah. Transverse process. Yeah, that's all. So let's have show and tell time, and then we can go home. Hey, Kristen, why don't you grab the light?
Sure.